In Chapter 4, we are switching to the last of our three critical literary lenses of this particular unit. And in Chapter 4, we are looking specifically at using a social justice lens. So, our goal is that you can analyze this chapter of the story, and really all of it, through this new kind of lens. So, what is a social justice lens? It's a theory focused on looking critically at race, thinking about the ways that race has very real impacts in society. But what do we mean by race? Because it's a complicated term. The definition we'll be using here is a group of people thought to share certain distinctive physical characteristics, such as facial structure and or skin color. Race is socially constructed, which means it is not a biologically inherent fact. It is a label created by society, but it has very real consequences. If people perceive your race as one thing or another, regardless of whether or not that actually describes you, it may impact the way you're treated in society. We're going to be using some other definitions, and these are all taken from Courageous Conversations, which is a district initiative talking about race, social justice, all of these big ideas. So, when we talk about racism, the definition we will be using in class is any act that even unwittingly tolerates, accepts, or reinforces racially unequal opportunities or outcomes. That means racism isn't just kind of explicit discrimination, name calling, slurs, refusal of services. It can also be much more minor things, stereotyping, systems that are set up so some people have less opportunities than others, anything that reinforces these unequal opportunities or outcomes. When we're talking about the idea of whiteness, this kind of connects back to what Benitha was saying in A Raisin in the Sun. This is the component of each and every one of ourselves that expects assimilation to the dominant culture, which in the case of America is white culture. So all of us, regardless of our racial background, face this tension between assimilating into the dominant or standing on whatever our own background is. And whiteness is going to be used to represent that pressure to conform to the dominant. Privilege is a right or advantage that is given to some people and not others. So, for example, some people are privileged because they have money and can do things others can't. Some people are privileged for reasons like physical or mental health. They do not need to be on medication for chronic issues. So, privilege is something that can be socially constructed and also something that can just be natural. It is not a good or bad thing necessarily, but it is something that we want to recognize. If we have privileges, we should be aware that not everyone may have the same opportunities. If we're limited and we're lacking privileges, we should be aware of why those privileges are being denied to us so that we can start to fix that. So, with those definitions in mind, when we're using a social justice lens, one key idea is that race is again this social construct created by cultures of people in order to group and define. And this has created racist systems within the way a community is structured and run. People identified as races that are not seen as the dominant group or the majority group are often discriminated against or just not taken into account. These systems that shape how our society is structured and run often treat individuals and groups differently based on their race and other aspects of their identity. Although race is our primary focus here, the social justice lens can also look at many other aspects of identity: gender, sexuality, age, physical status, mental status, all sorts of things. These systems, in our culture at least, tend to privilege and favor white people because these are systems that were created primarily by white people. If we look at the founding of America, the voices in the room designing those early laws were primarily white men. And it was not until much, much later that people of other identities were able to get a seat at the table. Because of this, people of color often experience racism, which may be undercover and sometimes even unconscious. If you grow up in a society that has racist structures, you may internalize some of those stereotypes and ideas, even if you don't fully recognize it in yourself. And this is still a form of racism. The social justice lens therefore seeks to remove focus from dominant groups, the groups that already have power and presence, and instead give the perspective of underrepresented groups. And this is very similar to what Steinbeck wanted to do with his writing. He wanted to focus on the stories that weren't being told, the stories about the ordinary people who didn't have much power. So, when we're turning a social justice lens to a text, there are several key questions we can ask. Firstly, where does race appear and shape the ways the characters interact with one another? Is race a big deal in the text? Does it seem to be ignored? Can we identify characters based on their race, or is that left ambiguous? How is racism challenged or accepted by the characters, and what problems arise from this? So, for example, in A Raisin in the Sun, we see Mr. Lindner accepting racism, saying this is just the way things are. And when the Younger family tries to challenge that, they face a lot of resistance. What systems are put in place based on race in the text? What jobs are available? What does society look like? Are there these different structures that treat people differently depending just on their race? How does race impact the outcomes of the characters? If a white character was instead non white, would that be likely to change their outcome? If a non white character was exactly the same person except they were white, would that be likely to change their outcome? How are different racial groups portrayed? Who's telling the story? Are they depicting racial groups sensitively and complexly, or are they relying on stereotypes and harmful ideas that seek to other certain groups? Whose perspective is the dominant narrative in the text? Who are we following along with? And whose perspective isn't shown as much? Are there characters on the fringes who maybe don't get as much of a say in the way we view the events that are described? So, just like our other lenses, we can tie this social justice lens back to our own society. If we examine our own society through a social justice lens, then one way that race impacts systems in our society is that, well, there are a lot of options. You can think of any in our range of society. How does race impact money and job opportunities? Think about Walter in Raisin in the Sun. How does it impact education? How does it impact leadership and politics? How does it impact healthcare? Another question we can ask is the dominant perspectives or the dominant narratives in our society are usually from the perspective of whom? Who is treated as the norm? If we're just saying a story where race and class and gender are not specified, what's kind of treated as the default? What does that say about who has power and again, who is seen as the dominant group? So these are the questions we'll be asking this week as we look at chapter 4 of Mice and Men and the ways that the characters struggle with powerlessness and loneliness.